Nonviolence. Chapter 1. Christian Abolitionism and Pacifism in the United States. Section. From Early Christianity to Christian Abolitionist Pacifism. The first groups committed to building a socio-political order characterized by nonviolence emerged in the United States. In 1812, when the Napoleonic Wars were raging, and the United States was at war with Great Britain, a fervent Christian, David L. Dodge, published what might be regarded as the first manifesto of the nascent nonviolent movement. War Inconsistent with the Religion of Jesus Christ. Such was the book's shrill title. Its argument piled it on. It was necessary to abstain from violence, even indirect participation in it, in all circumstances. Governments that did not respect divine law were to be unhesitatingly challenged. Indeed, quote, "The spirit of martyrdom is the true spirit of Christianity," end quote, and it was criminal to countenance any action that contradicted the Sermon on the Mount and presumed to legitimize violence. 1828 saw the formation of the American Peace Society, from which, 10 years later, a more radical organization separated, the New England Non-Resistance Society. Its stated intention was a return to early Christianity. However, what leapt out immediately are two programmatic declarations. First, it was asserted that the gospel message could only be restored in its purity by clearly distancing oneself from the Old Testament and the theme, well attested in it, of holy wars or wars of the Lord. Second, God had not, quote, restricted the precepts of the gospel to individuals. They also applied to states. Condemnation of war and violence in any shape or form must be concretely realized at a social level. The innovations compared with early Christianity are clear. It was not wanting in guarantees of continuity with the Old Testament and contained no condemnation of military service in principle. While the early Christians sometimes evaded it, it was so as to avoid taking an oath of obedience to an emperor who, in the state of emergency created by barbarian invasions, tended to have himself adopted as a god. The refusal to take an oath was intended as witness of fidelity to the one true God, an authentic religion, rather than the project of constructing a new society. It should be added that in the movement we are examining, quote, "the abolition of slavery is involved in the doctrine of non-resistance," end quote, as solemnly declared by the Non-Resistance Society. This is a further novel element. We are not led back to early Christianity or even the Quakers, who, notwithstanding their merits, long legitimized slavery. William Penn, quote, bought and owned Negro slaves. And in the first decades of the 17th century, quote, a Quaker-dominated government of Pennsylvania enacted a harsh slave code. End quote, from David B. Davis, The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. As regards international politics, violence was rejected by the Quakers with their focus above all on the Christian West, as emerges from an essay of 1693, in which Penn called for the establishment of peace in Europa in order to confront the Turkish threat. No, when we read the American pacifist abolitionists, what we find at work behind them is, in the first instance, the French Revolution, which in the course of its development abolished slavery and witnessed the emergence of hopes that the fall of the Ancien Regime betokened the end not only of dynastic wars, but of war as such. From Paris, Mirabeau had proclaimed that, following the conquest of general liberty, the senseless jealousies that torment nations would disappear and universal fraternity would blossom. Having denounced despotism and the ambition and thirst for power of feudal courts as the cause of the incessant wars that had hitherto racked humanity, numerous other revolutionary actors glimpsed the realization of the philanthropic dream of Abbé Saint Pierre, namely perpetual peace. This spiritual climate found its highest expression in the essay published by Kant in 1795. Beginning of long quote. Under a constitution where the subject is not a citizen, and which is therefore not republican, it is the simplest thing in the world to go to war. For the head of state is not a fellow citizen, but the owner of the state, and a war will not force him to make the slightest sacrifice so far as his banquets, hunts, pleasure palaces, and court festivals are concerned. He can thus decide on war without any significant reason, as a kind of amusement. End of long quote. Everything would change with the advent on a European or global scale of a republican, or representative constitution, that is, with the introduction of a political system capable of controlling power from below, as had occurred in France. Here we find ourselves in the presence of what, historically, is the first promise of the realization of perpetual peace in the wake of a revolution and radical transformation of political relations. However, prior to the 20th century, the dialectic of the broken promises of perpetual peace manifested itself at the dawn of contemporary history. With Thermidor, the very country that was the protagonist of the revolution exhibited an unstoppable expansionist drive. The problematic character of the discourse of the French Revolution, and of Kant himself, became especially evident on the American continent. Between 1812 and 15, a war unfolded there whose protagonists were the two countries, the United States and Britain, that at the time could boast the most advanced representative, or republican, in Kant's sense, constitution. This did not prevent the outbreak of hostilities, and in fact, the conflict developed with such ideological frenzy as to prompt Thomas Jefferson to declare that it could only end definitively with the extermination of one of the parties to it. The project of transcending the state of violence and realizing perpetual peace, appealing to political change and the community of republican institutions, had turned out to be an illusion. The Christian pacifist and abolitionist movement could not but take cognizance of the fact. Not dissimilar was the acknowledgement expressed later in Friedrich Engels' Antidurung, quote, "The promised eternal peace was turned into an endless war of conquest." End quote. The socialist movement, and Marx and Engels, adhered to the position of the French revolutionaries and Kant. Perpetual peace would be realized by destroying the socio-political system in which the scourge of war was rooted. However, this system was no longer identified as the feudal ancien regime and absolutism, but a society based on class oppression, whether feudal or capitalist. By contrast, the American Peace Society and the Non-Resistance Society considered it possible to solve the problem by rediscovering the original Christian message and its progressive penetration of popular consciousness. Nevertheless, the two U.S. movements themselves inherited something from the French Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment that ideologically paved the way for it. We should not underestimate the radical significance of the break with the Old Testament motif of the Wars of the Lord, which had repeatedly been mobilized by Protestant pastors in America to cast wars against the Redskins, and the French and British alike as holy. Likewise of great relevance is the project of constructing a political order no longer characterized by violence at home or abroad. What is especially thought-provoking is the juxtaposition of war and slavery. The latter had long been legitimized on the basis of a right of war exercised by the victor over the vanquished. One thinks in particular of Grotius. Rousseau, an author especially dear to the Jacobins, had retorted by denouncing slavery precisely as the continuation of the state of war. In Perpetual peace, Kant paid tribute to the French Revolution both for having abolished slavery in the colonies and for having laid down the premises for the realization of the ideal of peace. And in Christian abolitionist pacifism, active in the United States, the condemnation of war as the consummate expression of violence was intimately bound up with denunciation of the institution of slavery. So unequivocal and intransigent was this denunciation that it seemed fanatical to the ideologists of the slaveholding South, who had no hesitation in comparing American Christian abolitionists with the French Jacobins. The indissoluble link between the two causes is confirmed by the aggression which, a few years before the mid-19th century, the United States unleashed against Mexico. The victors reintroduced into Texas, wrested and annexed by the North American Republic, the slavery that had been abolished during the War of Independence against Spain. This was the moment of glory of the American pacifist movement, united, despite internal complications and divisions, in its scorn for the war for slavery and unprincipled depravity. Events seemed to fully vindicate the political and moral platform of the pacifist movement as a whole. By contrast, what was evaded in this platform was the issue of the Native Americans. The violence suffered by a pagan people did not seem to arouse the same degree of indignation as that provoked by the imposition of slavery on a largely Christian people. The happy period in the movement against the violence of war and slavery was, however, short-lived. The first signs of crisis soon ensued. What attitudes should be taken toward the revolution that invested the whole of Europe in 1848? In the case of France, this was an upheaval that included the definitive abolition of slavery in the colonies, restored in the interim by Napoleon, and the advent in the metropolis of a republic committed to relaunching the hopes and promises of perpetual peace deriving from the Great Revolution of 1789. Unlike on the occasion of the U.S. war against Mexico, pacifist commitment and abolitionist commitment now underwent bifurcation. It was a violent revolution that sealed the abolition of slavery and waved the banner of peace. Put in a difficult position by the new situation, the American Peace Society resorted to a subterfuge. It was cheered by the results, but overlooked the revolution that had yielded them. End of section.